All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for this call. Really excited for today's event. This is, always a great time to connect with Paul Salopek on his Out of Eden walk. And the theme couldn't be more perfect for this week. This week, we've been taking a deep dive into climate change. We've connected with over 20 scientists, explorers, filmmakers, photographers from around the world who have shared their stories and what they're seeing. They've been researching, they've been documenting, they've been looking for solutions to the climate change crisis that we are facing. So really excited to be joining Paul Salopek today. Paul has left Myanmar and is en route to China as he continues his epic Out of Eden walk. So Paul's 21,000-mile Out of Eden walk is a decade-long experiment in slow journalism, walking from Ethiopia to Tierra del Fuego, moving at the beat of his own footsteps. Paul is walking the pathways of the first humans who migrated out of Africa in the Stone Age and made the earth ours. Along the way, he's covering the major stories of our time, from climate change to technological innovation, from mass migration to cultural survival, by giving voice to the people who inhabit them every day. So here we go. I'm going to bring Paul in live with us. Hey, Paul, how you doing?
Hello. Good to see you, Joe. Welcome. Good to be here today.
Yeah, you as well, Paul. It's been a while since our last connection. You've been in Myanmar for a bit, so it's great to hear that you're in transition and on the move again.
Yeah, finally moving on to China, which is the next big country to walk through. It's going to be quite a journey, quite an adventure, probably 6,000 kilometers or 3,500 miles, probably taking over a year to walk across. So looking forward to that.
Wow, absolutely amazing. Paul, we have such a great group joining us today. The comment section in YouTube is filling up. Lots of people saying hi, so we'll give some shout outs in a moment. And then we've got a great group joining us from the Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants community, but also from the Out of Eden Learn community. So we're really looking forward to today, and I'm ready to pop up the PowerPoint. We're excited to catch up and talk a little bit about what you've seen around climate change on your journey.
No, absolutely. Let's go ahead and show that first image then, Joe, and I'll just kind of talk us through it and leave enough time at the end for questions, of course. And if you can go full screen on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I just want to remember.
Great. So, Joe, can you hear me? Joe, have you dropped off? I can't hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I popped myself backstage. We can hear you loud and clear, Paul.
Okay, all right. I'll just walk through it then. So look, for the last 8 years, I've been walking across the continents. And of course, when you're out walking, you're out in the weather, you're out in the elements. It's just a natural state of being. You're not indoors much, except at night when you're taking shelter. So what better a project than to kind of experience firsthand, through the skin, as it were, this very complicated, gigantic phenomenon, very troubling phenomenon of the climate crisis that we're all living through right now. And what I would like to do is just isolate a few examples of the kinds of changes that climate has brought to the people's lives that I've met along the way. You know, I'm not going to focus on the environmental aspects, on biodiversity, on the survival of species, on shrinking habitats. I'm going to focus on people on this chat, because that's who I interact with almost on a daily basis on my project. So next image. So as probably many of you might remember, I'm walking across the world in the footsteps of the first Homo sapiens, the first human beings, the first ancestors who spread out of Africa way back in the Stone Age, between 60 and 100,000 years ago. And that map gives you a little red line of sort of what my projected route is going to be. I've walked about 12,000 miles so far. I've got a good, I don't know, maybe, let's see, maybe at least 12,000 more to go, maybe more like 14,000. And after leaving Africa, I went through the Middle East, through the Caucasus, into Central Asia, through India, and now in Southeast Asia, pivoting towards China. After China, I'll walk north through Siberia, take a ship across the North Pacific, and then walk down to the very tip of South America called Tierra del Fuego. And that's kind of Land's End. That's my destination, and that was one of the last places in the world that our ancestors colonized way back, tens of thousands of years ago. So, one of the things that, people of my generation are probably often telling students that, things were different when we were young. The world was different. It was often harder just to make everybody feel like a little guilty, a little bad. But you know what? With the climate crisis that we're living through, this is the truth. My childhood, the world that I lived through my childhood, is slipping away, largely because of the changing weather around the world, the changing climate. And it's a phenomenon that we don't know where it's headed. We can make projections, scientists make analyses, they do statistical number crunching about where it might be getting wetter, where it might be getting drier, but it's a highly variable, complicated equation. So let me share with you sort of how that equation has affected the lives of some people along the way. Next image. When I left Africa, for example, I was spending time with camel nomads, people who moved animals around, pastoralists who moved from pasture to pasture throughout the year. These were people who were pretty much constantly on the move, and they were masters of their environment. They lived on a very difficult edge of desert and grassland, and they knew how to kind of extract the most energy, the most resources from that marginal, that iffy environment of almost anybody in the world. These are two groups, the Afar and the Isa. And what I noticed, that picture is of me and my Afar, ethnic Afnar colleagues walking north out of Ethiopia towards the Gulf of Aden with our cargo camels. What you'll notice from the pictures, it's really dry, right? It's bone dry. And that's mostly the case. This is one of the hottest, driest deserts in the world, the northern Rift Valley through Ethiopia, an area called the Afar Triangle, where it can get up to, I don't know, more than 110, 115, 120 degrees during the day. But it also does get rain. I mean, it's not completely dry. It's not the moon, right? So there is sporadic rain. And these pastoralists, these herders, know how to exploit the very brief rains that come. They move when they see clouds on the horizon that are raining, they know that in a week or so, the grass will be greening. So they start moving their flocks and their herds in that direction. They follow the clouds. These are people who are always doing this. They're always looking back and forth. The horizon, scanning the horizon for anything that looks like a drop of rain. Well, with the change of climate over the past, say, 2 generations, the rains have not just decreased, they've actually gotten more erratic. There used to be 7 known rainy periods. They're not seasons, they're like spells, and they each have their name in the local language. And these folks were very adept at kind of knowing what the next rain spell is going to be and where to position your herds to take advantage of it. But as these rain spells, these periods of brief rain start to get more erratic, more unpredictable, you can't plan ahead anymore. So you come into conflict with other people who might have their herds in a pasture already. And what's happening now is that it's created a heightened sense of conflict between these two herding communities, the Isa and the Afar, to the point where they're actually shooting at each other and killing each other over the very scarce grass and the drying water holes that they all depend on for survival. So right from the get-go, from starting my journey 8 years ago in Africa, within the first day, I was immersed in this conflict. I was moving around with Afar guides, trying to avoid their competitors, the Isa. We were hoping not to be seen. Sometimes at night we were camping without campfires so that they couldn't locate us as we tried to move quietly through what was basically a climate change stoked resource war, right? A battle over scarce water and grass. This is one example of a very negative impact of climate change on people living already on the edge. Next image. What does this kind of climate conflict create? What does the drying out of the Sahel in this part of Africa do? It pushes people out of the region, right? If you can't make it as a camel herder, if your camels are dying, if your goats are dying, if you're kind of up in the foothills struggling to get little scraggly crops going that are dependent on passing rains, and those rains are getting more and more crazy and erratic, they're arriving at different times, so your seeds don't end up growing or they rot in the ground, you have no choice. You either sit there and starve or you move, you vote with your feet. And so I met hundreds of people who were moving across. Look at that really rocky desert. It's like stony to the horizon. There isn't a blade of grass. I met hundreds of people on foot like me, moving because they were forced to move, like this gentleman who's drinking a bit of gruel, a bit of he's got grains mixed with water, and that's what he's using kind of as his rest stop of food to keep moving, to get out of his climate devastated homeland, to try to find a survival job somewhere else, often in another country. So this is a case where climate is actually pushing migration. It's pushing human migration. And the United Nations says there are already about 1 billion people around the world who are living or working outside of the countries or the places where they were born. That's about 1 in every 7 people. Climate is only making it worse, right? In this part of Africa, that some reports I've read, climate may be driving tens of millions of people away from their homesteads, away from their farms and pastures into cities. That's a massive change. Another big one caused by climate. Next image. So what about some positive effects of climate change? Because climate gives and climate takes away. So Joe, why don't you just play this video if you can, and let's see, it's very short. I think it's a minute. Now, I don't know if you can hear audio. I can't, but it doesn't matter. Basically, what you're seeing here is me and my walking partners setting up a camp in the country of Kazakhstan in Central Asia, where that year they had the heaviest rains in memory. They had rains that even people that were above 90 years old, look at that grass. It's lush. It's like a park. The oldest people in these pastoral communities, in these herding communities, had never seen grass like this. And in some cases, they didn't even know the name of some of the grasses coming up because the seeds had lain dormant for almost a century, waiting for massive rainfalls. So again, this is a case where a lot of rain, a change of rain that, in the Horn of Africa, it was getting erratic. It might have been disappearing. Here, torrential rain was creating a bounty of new plants, but also problems because it created massive shallow lakes and boggy kind of mud plains where these folks, sheep would get stuck and they would die because they couldn't get out of the mud. So another case of climate change in a different part of the world impacting mainly agricultural people. Next image. This is just a picture of my 2 walking partners inching towards the horizon. Look at that step. I mean, the grass in some places came up above our knees. It made this beautiful sound, this swishing sound when we would walk through it hour after hour, day after day, but it isn't what was normally there in living memory. This is something new, and even though it seems to be good, people are a bit wary. They're a bit rattled by it. Next image. Let's. I think this is another video, Joe. If you can kind of, I think this is even briefer. Now this is Afghanistan. You might have a picture of Afghanistan in your mind as a place of warfare, but look at this. This is beautiful wheat, white wheat, growing lushly high up in mountain valleys, up in the Hindu Kush and the Karakoram and the Pamir Mountains of far northeastern Afghanistan. It's gorgeous. This could be a painting. And I wanted to show this to tell you that, number one, Afghanistan is not a war. Afghanistan is a place with millions of people leading ordinary lives. But also to tell you that even here in this very remote mountain environment in Central Asia, where very few outsiders visit, I saw evidence of climate change as I walked through. The weeks that I was climbing, and these mountains were, some of them 24,000 feet, almost 8,000 meters, about 8,000 meters, covered with glaciers, and that was the key. So what is the climate change issue here? It's melting glaciers. Glaciers are melting like never before, and the farmers are experiencing a bonanza. They've got more water in their creeks, more water in their canals that is basically ice melt and snow melt that has been accumulated there over centuries, if not thousands of years. And think of it like this. Those glaciers are like a bank account that have been built up over evolutionary time. And now, for the first time in memory, those bank accounts are open. The floodgates are unlocked, and that capital of water, that big lump of water that's locked up on top of the mountains, is spilling down in the valleys, making for an agricultural bonanza. People were growing apricot trees. Look at this image. Look how beautiful that is. Look how lush it is. And that's up around about 13,000 feet. It's hard to believe. Next image. In some cases, people were growing vegetables that they'd never even tasted until 5 years before, growing gourds, growing carrots, growing tomatoes, things that they'd only heard of in the cities. But it comes again at a cost. You know, what nature gives, nature takes away. It's a balance. Next image. And this is what the high elevations of Afghanistan normally look like. It's very dry. It's a dry, cold desert. And those mountains behind, and even higher ones behind them, used to be covered with ice and snow. If you look at photographs from 100 years ago from explorers who walked through before me, and now they don't have an ice cube worth of ice on them. So that bonanza that we saw in the last image is temporary. It's like a bank account that's being drawn. It's like a casino. You win the lottery, but then you're just burning through it so that your children and grandchildren basically come back to this, which is a bone dry, cold desert where there's no water in the bank anymore. Last image. So where does all this lead? You know, again, this is something that all of you are probably studying in your classes, in your units, looking at climate change. It is complicated. Every region is different. It's hard to generalize, but the only constant is change. It's going to change for all of us. So I'll leave it there and open it up to any questions that might be popping up about walking through climate change across the world.
All right, Paul, thank you so much for those great stories, those great images, and such different stories, you know, from dry to changing patterns of rain, and how something that on the face of it, you might think, well, more rain, that's great, but it can bring a whole host of issues along with it. So it is a wildly complex issue, and it's so dependent on where you are in the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's one thing you learn as a storyteller is that, you know, look, but then look again and look hard, because what you get at first glance isn't often the deeper truth. And the deeper truth of a bonanza of grass, say, may hide problems that you don't see without further examination.
All right, absolutely. Well, let's start meeting some of our live classrooms, because I bet there's going to be a lot of great questions. So we're going to start off. Let's go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We've got some 8th graders hanging out with Mrs. Foster. Let's bring them in. Where are they hiding on me? There we go. Hey, Alabama.
Hi. How has climate impacted your journey so far?
Yeah, good question. Well, you know, I can say honestly that there hasn't been a day gone by that it hasn't impacted me somehow, right? Whether it's a very hot day or a very rainy day or a waterless day. So climate is, you know, it's one of the amazing things about long distance walking is that you literally are out like a character on an open stage under the sun. And every single hour, much less every day, changes. Think about it if you're walking to school, or if you're, you know, taking a hike on the weekend on a trail. Think about how your body reacts to walking under shade trees versus being out in the hot sun, or how it would be different on that very same trail a month later or a season later. So climate really shapes my walk in these very concrete ways. When wintertime comes and I'm facing a very big mountain range like the Caucasus or like the Himalayas, I'm stuck. I don't move. I have to stay in place and wait for the spring. And I've had to do that on a couple of occasions. And that's one reason why my project keeps getting longer and longer, because it's one thing to say that you're going to walk across the world and then you calculate, I'm going to walk 12 or 15 miles or 20 miles a day and do the math. But that math hides climate. That math hides snow-capped mountains where the snow comes up to your waist and you can't move, and you'll get cold and you'll get hypothermia. Or it hides deserts where the temperature gets so hot that your phone shuts off, right? That it just conks out and says it's operating above its normal temperature. Deserts so hot that you can't even walk during the day. You have to switch to walking at night because even your camels are starting to sit down in the heat. So climate affects every day of my journey. All
right. I think that's pretty par for the course with journeys is, you can plan to make a plan, but you're probably going to deviate from that plan quite a bit as things go on. You got to be flexible. All right, let's bring in a class here from Out of Eden Learn. Let's grab Mr. Lewis's class. They are joining us in Spain. Let me bring him into the call here. There he is. How are we doing today?
Hello, Paul. Encantado de conocerle. Nice to meet you. I know you speak Spanish as you grew up in Mexico. Me and my pupils, we are very happy to have you here online. And in fact, we wanted you to ask about the opposition leader in Myanmar, because I believe you're still in Myanmar. That's right.
I just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and ask.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I'm curious because in the media we cannot see any further news about Aung San Suu Kyi, former Nobel Peace Prize from Myanmar. So maybe you have, or you can update us in this information about Aung San Suu Kyi. We will be very grateful to have this information. Thanks very much.
No, thank you. And it's encantado conocerlos todos allí en España también. Me agrada mucho que me están acompañando en esta caminata. Look, the truth is nobody knows sort of, what's happening exactly with Aung San Suu Kyi. Basically, I get the same information that you do, even from local news sources or from my Burmese friends, is that she is probably under house arrest. She may have been moved from her house to another location, but the only time she has surfaced since the coup began back in the beginning of February was for a couple of court cases where she was filmed, coming into court, and it was very short. And the only words that we know that she's spoken on record since she's been in detention come through her lawyer, and basically he's just saying that he's not being allowed to see her. So that's about all I have for you on Aung San Suu Kyi.
Thank you very much, Paul. Muchas gracias. Mi clase te saluda. No te importa que te salude. Hasta luego. Thank you.
Saludos. Mil gracias.
All right. Great to see that group joining us all the way from Spain. Really cool. Let's jump to another class here. Let's go to Canada. Let's go St. Thomas. There's a couple grade 7 classes joining us with Mr. Thwaite. So let's bring one of them in here live with us. Let's pick this one first and see if we picked right. How we doing, St. Thomas?
Bonjour, monsieur. Hello, Joe. Thank you, Paul. We're so excited to have you today. Amelia has a question.
Great.
Did you ever have problems with food conservation in the more dry areas that you've been in, like the more of the deserty places or the places where it's cold or dry or something like that?
So a question about food conservation.
I've heard things with water, but I don't know if the same would go for food or other things that you would need to survive.
Merci, mademoiselle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, good question. Yeah, food. And that's climate affects that, of course, as you're pointing out. I mean, when I was walking through northeastern India, which is a tropical rainforest, it was very difficult to keep any food that would be fresh for very long, because within 24 hours it would be covered with mold. In fact, anything that I was carrying on me that was organic would soon be covered with mold. My wallet was covered with mold. My belt was covered with mold. Heaven knows, probably I had mold growing on my head. I have no idea. But the notion of how you carry food with you for a long walk, because when you walk you need extra calories and extra joules to kind of keep you going. So the secret though is not to get hung up on ordering super high-tech foods online, this expensive stuff that you can get from specialty stores. My secret, which is no secret at all, is to depend on local knowledge, local expertise. Whatever local people are eating is what you eat, because that is probably the healthiest for that environment. It's probably the freshest, straight from the ground. And farmers and herders and fisher people, the people that I often deal with, also use their bodies an awful lot. They need a pretty high caloric intake. So I welcome their diet. And in deserts, where things keep longer, right, because it's dry, there are low bacteria counts, you can carry things like dry grains, dry fruits. You can carry honey. You can carry bread if you want. It takes up a lot of space, but it lasts forever. Even when it's hard and stale, it's still edible in a desert. And in wetter climates, it's a lot of vegetables. It can be fish. If you eat meat, I mean, there's people have domestic animals. A lot of rice lately, right, in Southeast Asia and Northeastern India. Rice is the staple. So yeah, look at what local people are doing and emulate it to the best of your ability, and you'll be okay.
There we go. We're going to jump to another classroom. This classroom is another Out of Eden walk group, and they are joining us from Greece. We've got Miss Kuyuruki joining us. I am going to bring her into the call. Oh, there we go. Oh, can you grab the mic for me?
Hi, Paul. Thank
Hello.
you for sharing your stories with us. We've been following your journey since this October, and we are amazing. And we are teaching remotely this period. So my kids are watching you from YouTube, and I have to go to find them, but they have a lot of questions. So I have, can I do 2 questions? Is it possible?
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
sure.
So the first one is this: has climate change affected the way schools operate among the countries you have visited? And this question comes from Kostis.
No, Kostis, that's a really good question. It's one that I've not investigated. It's one that I should probably look into. I know that when I started out in the Horn of Africa, Kostis, in Ethiopia, there were traveling schools. There were schools that were actually loaded on the backs of camels. The government had nomadic teachers and nomadic classrooms. And, they would be as affected as the students themselves about climate change. So like if in that area where there was conflict, where there was fighting, those schools might have difficulty operating. So there's a case where climate might even affect education directly, right? I think climate change would affect a lot of things about education. One of the ones that comes to mind is nutrition. We talked about food. If climate change affects crops, if it affects your caloric intake as a kid, as a student, you may not have the energy to focus, to do your best in class. So it would affect, educational outcomes even in that way. In other places, like where has it like flooded out schools? That I don't know, but good question.
Okay, thank you so much. And one more question. Here it comes from Vasilia. She's asking whether among the countries you have visited, which one do you distinguish as the one that its inhabitants pay the most attention to the environment?
Oh, wow. Well, that's a great question. I would have to say that I can't pinpoint the country. I would turn the question a little bit on its side and say, what trade or what job or what pursuit do people pay the closest attention to climate change? And you could probably guess it's farmers, right? Farmers and herders. Again, they depend on things like the rain. They depend on things like river water. They depend on pools. They depend on well water. And so whether they're in Ethiopia or India or in Myanmar, farmers often are the most affected and the most expert at describing how climate has changed. If you go to a big city, it's not that people are blind to the change, but they just aren't able to pinpoint it and go into the fine detail that a farmer does.
All right, 2 great questions. Thank you so much to our group joining us in Greece. Let's see. Let's head now to Virginia. We're going to go to Salem. We've got some grade A's hanging out with us with Miss Painter. Let's grab them and bring them in with us. There we go. Hey, Miss Painter.
Hello. My students are sitting on the other side of the camera, but we have a question from Brody. He wants to know, when you were walking through Afghanistan, did you ever have any encounters with the Taliban?
Okay, sure. Well, Brody, yeah, I walked through a part of Afghanistan where the Taliban had not reached. That said, when I first entered that part of Afghanistan, groups affiliated with the Taliban were attacking nearby villages. And so for a few days, I had to wait before crossing over to make sure that it was safe. But the people who inhabit the Wakhan corridor, this kind of very slender finger of territory that kind of pokes up towards China, those people are two distinct ethnic groups that are different from a lot of the rest of Afghanistan, which itself is very diverse, right? So keep in mind when you're reading about Afghanistan that it's not this one same country. It's got regions and different cultures, different languages, in some ways more diverse than some European countries. And the people who were up in the high mountains where I was walking were Wahi, they were Ismaili, they were Shia Muslims who were very different from the Muslims that adhere to the Taliban's ideology. So no, I didn't run into any difficulties from the Taliban.
You'd think I'd be used to this, hosting, up to a dozen live events a week. Mike will always.
Normally I do that, Joe.
Paul, that's the stories that you're sharing are so important, because when we turn on the news, when we read, we often only see one small part of a country or one story, and that frames the narrative for so many people when, countries are so rich and so diverse, and one story, one issue doesn't make a country.
It would be the example I would give to our friends, whether it's in Spain, Greece, Canada, or the United States so far, is if you got one news report and it was from one small town in your country, how representative that would be of the entire country? Not very, right? So Afghanistan is a cosmos. India is a vast and complicated cosmos. People refer to Africa as if it were a country. I'm sorry. 1 billion people live there. There are dozens of countries. Inside one country alone, like the Congo, there are up to 200 different dialects. So it's, the human species is vastly diverse. It's part of the fun of this walk.
Absolutely. Let's go to Chicago, Illinois this time. Mr. McFarland is joining us. I'm just going to pop him up onto the screen. There he is. Hey, Chicago.
Hi. Hi, Paul. Greetings from Chicago. We know you spent some time here earlier in your career, so a little bit of a homecoming for you. Samantha has a question for you.
Okay.
We read that one of the impacts of climate change can be the loss of historical sites. Have you come across any examples of this in places you've walked through?
Wow, that's a fantastic, Samantha. That's a great question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. I think the first one would be, what's happening even in the Rift Valley of Africa, which, as you may know, holds some of the oldest fossils of humans and pre-humans. And as the weather patterns change there, a big river called the Awash, where very famous skeletal, fossil skeletons of ancient hominids were found, like Lucy, Australopithecines, and even much older. Those areas may change as the river changes, right? With sedimentation. Also, further on in Turkey, I'll never forget, I was walking along a coastline where there was heavy coastal erosion. And there in Turkey, which is one of the oldest kind of continuously farmed parts of the earth anywhere, 8,000 years of farming with ancient civilizations. And the ruins of these civilizations are often these mounds called tells. They're like a saucer-shaped mound on a plain. It's like a little bump. One of these bumps was actually being eaten away by the waves, and thousands upon thousands of pieces of pottery, probably maybe as old as the Iron Age, were just dropping into the sea. So a really valuable archaeological site was vanishing due to coastal erosion.
All right, a great example of what's probably happening in a lot of places.
Indeed. Yeah.
We're going to head to Sudbury, so back to Canada. We've got Mr. Markwick's grade 4s hanging out with us. Bring him in.
Hi there, Paul. Hi there. How you doing? Paul, been a big fan. Been following you 2013. We've got lots of classes here in Sudbury following along today. We've got Mr. Bacon and Mr. Dunn's classes here at the board. But I have a question for you from one of my students, Samantha. Go ahead.
What has his journey taught him to survive?
Oh, okay. Well, Samantha, that's a good one too. And that, that includes things like climate into covering everything, right? I think walking teaches you the survival skill that might be the most important one that all of us, whether it's there in Canada or at the tip of South America or in China or in the Arctic, the most important human survival skill of all is getting along with each other. Walking teaches that, right? So I can say that after years of walking out among different types of people, different languages, different nationalities, different religions, people doing very different things with their lives, right? This kind of kaleidoscope of life. Walking among that, you are exposed in ways that are more profound than if you were driving through it in a car, or certainly if you're flying to it in an airplane, because walking puts you into direct contact with people every single day, many times a day. You can't roll up the car window, put the earbuds in and listen to music and drive by them, because you have to interact. Think about it. If you're walking in like a country lane and somebody's walking by, you can't just ignore them. That's kind of strange. You say hello, you nod to them, or at least you acknowledge them. And so walking has built up muscles of empathy. It's built up muscles of understanding and muscles of curiosity that I think are my best survival tools, no matter what the environment, whether it's ice-capped mountains or the jungles of Northeast India or the hot deserts of Saudi Arabia. If you have those very human and humane survival skills, just to basically get along, which often means just listening to people, listen to them tell their stories, you'll be okay. And I think as we move forward all together into the 21st century, I think we're just going to need these skills more and more, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Great questions today from everybody. I just want to say, I see lots in the chat. I haven't forgotten about YouTube. I'm going to go there shortly, but just great questions today. So thank you to all of our classrooms today. Miss Lee in Massachusetts is joining us. Let me bring her in. How are we doing, Miss Lee? Oh, can you grab the mic for me?
Thank you so much for taking the questions. Unfortunately, my students left all their questions. One of them wanted to find out how this pandemic, how COVID has changed your journey, or have you noticed any sort of behavioral changes amongst people, this overall impact as you've been traveling since it started last year?
Yeah, that's another great question. Yeah, COVID has impacted me and my journey as much as anybody else's life. I've had to pause the walk in Myanmar for well over a year now, waiting for borders to reopen, waiting for quarantine protocols, waiting for isolation kind of rules to kind of ease. Just imagine walking from village to village, no matter in what country, and you're a stranger in a pandemic. That's not a good thing, right? Because you could be carrying the virus with you and spreading it. You could be, even if you don't have the symptoms, you could be a spreader. So COVID has made the journey very difficult to keep going. And I'm hopeful that with the advent of vaccines, that things will start to open up. And I'm counting on that now as I sort of turn towards China. Have people dramatically changed their behavior? From what I've seen in Myanmar, yes and no. I mean, it's probably like where you are. There are people who have changed their lives, and people who haven't. But one of the things about Southeast Asia that's really important, I've written about this recently, is that there already has been a tradition of wearing masks here that predates COVID-19. People do it as a courtesy to others. If they have a cold, they're very thoughtful that, if they're on a bus or if they're in a crowded area or even on a sidewalk, you'll see people wearing masks. So that part hasn't really changed too much. And I think, keep in mind that with economies here, sometimes they're people are kind of on the rough edge of existing. If it's a choice between feeding your family and adhering to, say, quarantine rules or isolation rules, and you've got children that need to go to school, that need to eat, you have to kind of be practical and realistic about how many of these roles you can observe. So a lot of people, are continuing to do what they always do.
Okay. I want to take a minute and jump to YouTube so we don't leave our great crew of classrooms joining in on YouTube. Mr. Lebrun has a great question here, and his class is wondering about when you're in some of the more rural areas, some of the more impoverished areas, do they understand how much of this is due to a global climate change? Is there climate change education in these areas?
And that's a really good question. That's a thoughtful question. It's thinking about local versus global knowledge. How much has information penetrated? It's everywhere. Nobody talks about local stuff, at least in my experience. And I've talked to thousands of people. Look, even when I started out 8 years ago, climate change, the climate crisis was already kind of vibrating in the air. People were talking about it. It was in the news. But it's only gotten more urgent. It's only gotten more important. So even in the most geographically isolated regions that I've walked to, from like city centers, from places where there are large media hubs, for example, people know that it's a global phenomenon. People look up at the sky and they may talk about their local condition. They may talk about how their last crop was ruined and they don't know what they're going to do, except maybe take the last of their money and jump on a bus and go to the city and try to work as a laborer. But they always couch it within a global context. People are aware that this is a shared experience across class, race, nationality, that we're all in this boat together, the boat being the planet, right?
I got myself again. I wonder if there's any sense of frustration, Paul, in these communities, because they've had this way of life and it's contributed very little, if anything, to the climate crisis. Do you sometimes find a sense of frustration?
That level of knowledge is less common, where there's kind of a sense of awareness that, how much our community contributes versus how big industrialized nations do. That would, I think a minority of people would bring that up. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure whether that's being taught in the education system or whether that's just being lost in all the buzz, like in the radio or the TV programming, about the kind of inequality between the producers of most of these gases and the people who might be paying the worst cost. Countries like Bangladesh, as you know, which are very low lying and they're literally losing their country as sea levels rise, are not a major producer of climate change emissions. So there's deep unfairness in this. But, remarkably, most people don't bring that up.
Okay. So, Paul, how are we doing for time? Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure. Absolutely.
All right. Let's work in a few more. So I'll visit a few more of our live classrooms. Let's start with Mrs. Foster's group. I see someone with a question handy. Oh, grab the mic for me, bud. You'd think we've been doing this for so long, this virtual learning, but the mic.
That's what I'm saying. So I know you were talking about the complications you've had when you've been evaluating the weather and all that, and you said you were talking about the scarce food resources that you have encountered. But how do you prepare when you walk through Siberia and these harsh climates? Like, what do you bring, or how do you prepare mentally and physically for that?
That's another great question. And, I take my cues again from local folks. I mean, I've been a hiker my whole life. I was, when I was just a kid in California, I climbed Mount Whitney when I think I was 14. So I was like a very avid hiker. So I've got good muscle memory to keep going, to keep plodding along. But you do need to stoke that engine. So I try to be mindful about looking at the local, like when I go to a local market or a bazaar, about what are the high caloric foods, what has a lot of energy in it, dried fruits, nuts, things like that, often are what keep you going in short periods. But you can't, as you know, if you've hiked a long time, if you've taken long distance trips for a week or so, those kind of empty calories, energetic calories are not enough. You end up starting losing muscle mass too. So one answer to your question is, if I know like there's a really rough stretch of desert coming ahead or like really cold mountains, I try to make sure that there's some refuge or some shelter just over them after, like, say, a week's walk or maybe maximum 2 weeks walk, where I can recoup, where I stop and I just do this, right? Just start eating and resting and building up my reserves again. So it's not, it's not like a continuous journey that's like day after day, week after week, because I would waste away to nothing. I wouldn't be here talking to you. So it involves, I guess, pacing is the answer, right? Probably the same thing you do when you go on long distance hikes, or if you're a long distance swimmer or whatever, you pace yourself.
All right. Chicago, let's bring Mr. McFarland back in. Oh, yeah.
Yep, keep going along the path. Got Sloan here with a question.
We know about large scale ways to combat climate change. What are some stories you can share with us about ways smaller communities you've come across have made decisions that positively impact the climate?
Oh, great. Well, what a fantastic question. That's great. That's the question that a good reporter, a good storyteller needs to be asking as she or he goes out and encounters these kind of issues. I've seen both reactions to climate change, mostly reactions, not like being proactive. You know what I mean? It's not like there are people who are changing their life for climate. They're actually changing their life as a result of climate, right? It's a rare human being that will change their life for future generations, right? Of their children or grandchildren, especially if it's hard. So what I could mainly talk about is how communities I've walked through have adapted in small ways, but very powerful and important ways, to ensure their own survival and the survival of their children and grandkids into the future in a changed climate world. One is in India, the digging of millions of tiny wells, catchments. I walked through states of central northern India where for hundreds of kilometers, I was rarely out of a small kind of check dam that might have been only like, we're talking a dam that's only less than a foot high, built across a dry gulch, and not just one, but maybe 20 or 30 of them, that local farmers had begun building to catch the water as it rains, to catch that precious rainfall, to keep it, to preserve it for them as the climate gets more erratic, as rainfall gets more erratic. That's one example. Another great example is just changing the crops that you grow, right? Changing the food that you eat. So there are parts of Rajasthan in India, a very dry western region of that gigantic country, where farmers are starting to look again, some farmers are starting to look again at older crops that did better in climate-stressed environments, in low water environments. Because guess what's happened over the last, say, 50 years? With the advent of fossil fuels that can then power pumps, there's been a water bonanza that's, again, borrowed water. This is sometimes fossil water, and certainly the fossil fuels are fossil. They're not eternal. Has given them the ability to grow crops that are just inappropriate. Water-heavy crops, rice. I mean, imagine growing rice in a desert, for crying out loud. It makes no sense whatsoever. But it's profitable, so people have grown it for 20 or 30 years. But now, as the water starts to dry up, people are being forced to innovate, not just by looking to future technologies, but by looking at the ancient technologies that were really tried and tested for thousands of years, and growing things instead like millets, right? A grain that's really adapted to droughts. So these are just a few of the small things that I've seen that local people have taken the initiative to try to make their contribution to enduring this crisis.
All right, great question from our crew in Chicago. I know that there's a question from Nate. He is in St. Thomas. I think this is the right stream. Let's pick this one, see if we can get Nate. There we go.
Hello.
Okay. Hi.
Oh, we're confused now. We've got two different.
That's okay. I've got the right one. Nope.
Oh, what was the most?
Can you guys hear me?
What is your question, Nate?
Nate had a really good question. I'd love to grab Nate's question. Okay, I'm just going to read it out. So Nate would like to know, what keeps you motivated during times when you want to give up? Are there times when yeah, you want to just sit down and this is enough. What keeps you motivated?
Yeah. That's a legitimate question. The easy answer, and it's an honest answer, is I've not wanted to give up yet. So I don't have a pat, response to that. I would have to make up something. What if I do want to give up, which is conceivable, and I tell my readers, I tell my audiences, I tell the students following that, when this no longer becomes interesting, when it's not fun anymore, when I'm not learning anymore, I reserve the right to say, hey, I'm going to stop. But so far, that I haven't reached that point yet. Staying motivated when your classroom is the world, when your chalkboard extends over the Himalaya mountains into snow-capped peaks going into the state of Yunnan, where you know that waiting on the other side of that mountain is an ecosystem that has some of the richest biology in the world, the richest botany. When you know that there are cultures and ethnic groups that are extremely fascinating, there are matriarchal groups where women call the shots. It's hard not to be motivated. It's hard not to be excited. What I've compared it to many times in the past is it's a classroom where the subject changes every single day and never is repeated. Every day is a new subject. In the close to 3,000 days that I've been walking now, every single day has been a different class. It's impossible to get bored. So I'm highly motivated.
Great way to put it, Paul. I don't think you'll ever be bored or tired of the walk. And I think that kind of brings me to the final question that's come up a lot in YouTube. It comes up in every talk that we have. Everybody wants to know how much longer. Do you even think of that anymore? Is in your mind, is it when I'm done? That's how much longer.
Well, I know certain people in my life do, are asking how much longer, but including some editors. But I think I'm roughly at the chronological, the time-wise, more or less the halfway mark of the walk. The walk was originally envisioned to be 7 years. I've gone on year 8. One of these years has just been waiting out COVID-19. And so, I could get disappointed, I could get frustrated, but you know what? That's all part of the story. That's all part of the journey. And if you look at it that way, then it becomes just another topic to investigate. It becomes another question to ask about life, right? So I think, maybe another 5-6 years, I don't know, because there's a big stretch of water that's going to go very fast. People keep pointing out, well, look how long this trail is that you have left. But they keep omitting that a big chunk of it, maybe a third of it, is going to be by cargo ship across the North Pacific, which will go very quickly in the matter of like a week or 10 days. I'll be walking very fast around the deck of that boat.
Yeah, you can't stop walking. All right. Well, I want to start off with just a huge shout out to the YouTube crew today. Thank you to all the classrooms that joined, whether it was from the Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants community or the Out and Learn community. A huge shout out to all of our camera classrooms. What great questions today. Great to see everybody and representing 4 different countries, which is awesome. Yeah, and Paul, always a pleasure. Thank you, for doing these events with us and for covering this theme today, because it is such, we're thinking about the pandemic right now, but compared to the looming threat, it makes the pandemic look very, small.
That's exactly right. This is a crisis that will be with us the rest of our lives and the rest of our children's lives, going into the future. So let's put our heads together, see if we can come up with something that will help change for the better.
All right. Well, Paul, good luck as you continue your transit to the next portion of the journey. Huge shout out to all the classrooms again. And I hope everybody has just a great weekend.
Great. Thank you again, Joe. Thank you, everybody. Great questions. Great to see you all again.